Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my America's Challengers round number 1 overview and analysis video. I want to start this off by apologizing that this video is coming out so late. I'm sitting here at 3 in the morning recording this Eastern time in terms of where I'm at. Round 2 has already started. A lot of the games have already been played, and so I do apologize that this video is essentially coming out delayed, but just had to take care of some real life things first, and so I very much do apologize for that, but I wanted to separate the video still, so we're still going to be doing round 2 by itself tomorrow. Today is just going to be the round 1 matchups, the first best of 3s, and not the winners finals and the 3rd, 4th place matchup, the lower bracket round 1 matchup. That's going to be saved for another video that's going to come out, of course, later on in the day, probably as you're seeing this, but that disclaimer out of the way, it's time to get into round 1. We're done with the group stage. We are done with the round robin. We know the 4 teams that have qualified for the playoffs here, the first 2 teams that are out. If you want to know my thoughts on the tournament leading into this, check out the playlist up in the iCard. That's every single day, all 3 of them done in a very similar format to what you are seeing in today's video. But of course, today, we're going to be going over the best of 3s that these 4 teams ended up playing in round 1. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and I will be giving a player of the series at the end of each series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, lightly be touching upon the games that are coming up in round number 2 for those of you who haven't seen them, me included. I have not seen the results of what happens after this, and so I'm definitely not spoiled going into this. I don't know what happened out of the teams that won or lost today, but I do know what happened in round 1, so let's get right into that. I'm very excited to go over it. Our first series is a CBLOL Academy rematch of the finals. I'm very excited to get into this one. It's the number 1 seeded Pain Academy taking on the number 4 seeded VKS Stars Academy, and this being kind of your, big matchup of round 1, I think is very poetic. Obviously, both teams coming out of Brazil, Brazil being the home nation for this tournament, and these being the only 2 teams to both be a part of the same region in this bracket stage. It's just a lot of poetic justice coming through. Pain only having 1 loss in the group stage, that, of course, being to VKS. Like, there are just so many storylines going into this that I think are interesting to talk about. Of course, VKS Stars having beat Pain Gaming to be the number 1 seed going to this tournament. I think a lot of people expected a lot from them. I was not necessarily one of them. I was one of the few people who walked away from watching the finals in the CBLOL Academy and saying, I think Pain is a more complete, well-rounded team, and I think Kisei on the day was just the best player on the Rift, and they didn't really have an easy answer for him being able to play this early aggressive style and then moving into side lanes, and that has carried over into this tournament. It just feels a lot more comfortable for VKS, especially against Pain Academy. I'm going to cut right to the chase and talk about the important context of this series. Whoever is able to get early leads in these games, they're going to win this best of 3. End of story. That is how both teams like to operate. If VKS is going to be able to dominate and control the tempo with some of the picks like Elise and like Yone that they've been able to utilize over the course of this tournament, then I think they are pretty easily going to be able to repeat the performances that they put up against Pain over the course of the last few months. But Pain is a very good team from ahead, and so if they're able to get the early leads, then I think they are going to be the team that actually ends up doing really well in this series. It's all going to come down to who ends up getting leads like 10 to 12 minutes into the game. Genuinely, I think that is the most important thing to do, and so if I have some advice for these 2 teams, it's not to draft scaling. I don't want to see Maokai. I don't want to see these more passive mid laners, things like the Smolder. I just don't think it's necessarily viable in a series like this. Maybe increased priority in things like Callista and things like Misfortune, even a Varus to a smaller extent. All of those things I think are much more valuable in a series like this than they would be normally, because I don't think scaling is really an option for either of these 2 teams with how they've played against each other in particular. When you're looking at the important matchups, obviously the first one that comes to mind is Kotz versus Kisei in the mid lane. I think that is obviously the one that everyone's going to point to, but Marvin for me for Pain has been one of, if not the most consistent player at this tournament up until this point, and I think if he has another pop-off performance coming out of that AD carry role, that could be massive for Pain. I think Morteus is more than good enough on the other side of this matchup to be able to match him. Sorolu, Tyr, Telos, they've all been okay for VKS, but Hidan had an amazing group stage. Tatu, I think, showed a lot of fun things. I think Giggs is also a very interesting player, and so I maybe see this a bit differently than a lot of other analysts. I see this as a lot closer to being a 50-50 than it is to VKS being favorites, like I see a lot of people talking about, and like I would expect the conversation to be going into a series like this because of past results. I just don't know if Pain cannot be the better team. I think on paper they're more talented. I think VKS has just had their number. We'll see if that carries over. It is of course a best of 3, which means that you kind of have to win game number 1. Having to win both of the final 2 games is just a much bigger challenge. Think of what I talk about game 3 in a best of 5. That's essentially what game 1 is. It controls the tempo of the entire rest of the series. It is the most important game of the entire best of 3. So both teams definitely want to come out on top, but only one is going to be able to do it. Which one will it be? Well, the winner of game number 1 was Pain Academy. They are going to take game number 1 of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was a very clinical, very well executed game, and this is basically exactly what we were talking about in the preview, where one team just gets this slight advantage and it slowly snowballs out of control until the point where the other team just doesn't really have any tools to utilize to fight back. I think this was an excellent performance coming in from Pain, kind of showing why they were the number 1 seed, the only 4-1 team coming in to the playoffs here. I think the most impressive part of this victory in Game 1 for me in particular is Kotz in the mid lane, who was a very easy choice for player of the game on the Azir. He was not someone that particularly stood out to me in terms of the group stage and the beginning of this tournament. I think we got a lot of really big highlight plays from Hidan and Marvin. In particular, Tatu I think had a couple of really good games as well, but Kotz was kind of a little bit under the radar for me. I thought that there were a lot of mid laners like Kisei, like a Blaze Olive, that had really been showing up at this tournament and showing out in that role, and Kotz was just kind of along for the ride when it came to Pain, but give him his Azir and he's going to go 10-0-5 and he's going to do an absolute boatload of damage. This just was a great showcase of how good he can be in some of these front-to-back fights, and honestly this raises my confidence in Pain quite a bit, because I think when you are looking at this series in terms of on-paper matchups, you could talk about players like Morteus being about as good as Marvin. You could talk about, someone like Sorolu being about as good as Tatu, at least in terms of what we have seen at this tournament, but mid lane was always going to be a hurdle that Pain needed to overcome, and that was kind of their problem in the finals, at least from when I watched it. But with Kotz performing like this on something like Azir, that conversation becomes a lot easier for Pain to be able to stomach. I think banning out the Elise, banning out the Yone, even the Ezreal, which we've seen Kisei pilot really well inside lanes, I think it's a really good idea. Tristana is a very strong champion, but we'll get to why Kisei just wasn't very relevant. I think a couple of draft gaps here, Pain definitely getting an advantage on blue side. The Gnar on B4 is gigantic. Not only does it do very well into Cassante, it's a very good lane matchup, but Gnar was a huge problem for Kisei in the mid lane on the Tristana. He could never really get going because Gnar was making his life a lot more difficult, and I think generally that kind of draft gap ended up pushing things ahead. I think the Kalista is a great idea in a series like this because, like I said, generating that pressure and that priority on the bottom side of the map is so integral towards being able to win these games against teams like VKS, and I love that pick. I think Skarner has really risen in popularity. Generally, I just think the meta looks correct for Pain. I think this is a very good read. The Azir might be a little bit slower than what I would like, especially going into something like Tristana, but I think it does give you an out, and obviously Kotz was really good at it. So overall, certainly can't be frustrated with how Pain played here in game 1. But for VKS, not a good game 1. This was really not what you were looking for if you're a VKS fan. I think Kisei is going to get dud of the game for me. He was completely taken out of it both by the Azir and by the Gnar, even to a smaller extent by the Skarner. It just never really felt like the Tristana was able to get in on a lot of the action and actually make a noticeable difference in this game, and that has got to be frustrating for a player in Kisei who has been kind of the heart and soul of VKS, of VKS Stars, over the course not only of this run at this tournament, but their playoff run as well. He has been their star player, and for him to not be particularly good, certainly not be the better mid laner in game 1, it's a little bit concerning. I think Sorolu needs to be better. Tyrion got run over in the top lane. I know his scoreline probably looks the most defendable about everyone, but he was down so much in terms of gold, and especially in pressure in the mid game. It allowed the Gnar to be such a nuisance, like I said, to everyone else on the map. It actually was one of the most detrimental things to VKS's game as a whole. The Kai'Sa Rel were never able to get online because they had to lane into a Kalista and the rest of their team lost. It just was a bit of a disaster for VKS Stars, which which is why I don't really like picks like this. I think K'Sante is fine, but Maokai plus Kai'Sa just feels way too passive for me. If you want to be able to play through the middle of the map, then yeah, you can pick something like, I don't know, Kai'Sa, or I don't know, I would go for something like Jhin in this game because it could be a lot more self-sustaining, and you can have Rel roam mid lane and try to get the Tristana ahead, but Maokai, not the champion to be able to facilitate that. I get that a lot of the big picks like the Elise, like the Ivern were taken off the board here, but there are plenty of other options on this patch. Things like Xin Zhao got buffed, and I just don't understand why teams are so afraid to go to an early game aggressor like that. Hell, if you want an engager that's good in the later half of the game, at least pick Vi. That's something that can do something in that instance, but Maokai continues to just be the priority pick for anybody who wants to default to something that can be stable in the later half of the game, and I just don't know if that's going to work in a series like this. So that's my, recommended suggestion for a change in Game 2 for VKS, is to just go for something a lot more aggressive. That's been what's worked for this team, and I think just because you're getting the Elise and the Yone taken away doesn't mean you don't have other options in those roles to potentially fill that void. But for Pain, great game number 1, about as perfect as you could ask for. If you can 2-0 VKS, especially out of this first round, kind of get your revenge for the last couple of losses, the last 4 losses that you've suffered at the hands of them, that's gigantic. And so really happy for Pain, but they've got to be able to deliver here in Game 2. You don't want to give the momentum right back to VKS. You want to be able to close this out in a 2-0 sweep, but VKS, of course, playing for their upper bracket life. Who's going to be able to take the second game? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Pain Academy. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series in a very clean 2-0 sweep, and they're going to be moving on to winners finals, to round 2. And, we haven't talked about it yet. We haven't talked about the format, but because the format is the way that it is, because semifinals and finals are the only 2 series that are best of 5s, it means staying in the upper bracket is actually super crucial, and it makes your job so much easier because getting to winners finals is best of 3. Like that, you don't have to play a best of 5 until finals if you are a team that ends up winning both of those series. And so staying in the upper bracket is very, very crucial for a lot of these teams, and Pain being able to get there so effortlessly and kind of vanquishing that demon that they have yet to be able to conquer in the last couple of months or weeks, really, is gigantic for them. This team was very clearly the best team in CBLOL Academy over the course of the year. They've been talking about it a lot, but even just watching the tape, again, I didn't watch the regular season, I didn't watch any of their spring tape, but just from the eye test, if you just watch the finals, and even really a lot of the playoff run for Pain Academy, it was very, very clear, in my opinion, that they were the better team as opposed to VKS. Maybe not in terms of just general matchup and general execution, because I think VKS had a very good idea of what they were good at and how they wanted to get the most out of that with players like Kisei and Sorolu, and in particular kind of running the early game, but Pain very clearly was more talented. When they were given the opportunity to just play from neutral, they were always better than VKS, and so to come into this series, it's really not surprising to see Pain come out on top. They've been the better team at this tournament. They've been the best team at this tournament, and I think they continue to prove that with the sweep here. Player of the game and player of the series for me is going to go to Hidan in the top lane. I think Tatu definitely deserves a big shout out for this game on the Xin Zhao. I think he was top damage in the whole game. Guys, Xin Zhao's really good. I think that this champion should get picked a lot more. I haven't really seen him at all in America's Challengers, which concerns me. It makes me think that teams aren't necessarily prioritizing him in the way that they should, but Hidan definitely showing up at America's Challengers. This Ornn is not supposed to be doing the second most damage in the entire game. That I can definitely tell you. This was just a dominant performance. Hidan has incredibly clearly, in my opinion, been by far the best top laner at this tournament. I don't even think there is anybody that is going to be contesting him for that. He has genuinely been terrific. He has beaten everybody that he's gone up against, and he had such a big impact across both of these games. Of course, on the Ornn here, just CC layering VKS into oblivion in most of these fights. The Leona plus the Ornn makes it impossible for VKS to play from behind because they have absolutely no way to engage ever on this team, but even the damage he was able to put out, the cleanup work he was able to do, the frontlining he was able to do, he was just so valuable across this entire one. Of course, we talked about the Gnar performance in game number 1. That was a great showing from him as well, being able to understand, okay, if I am just able to dominate this matchup and get out on the map, we can completely run the mental part of the game, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Hidan was just terrific from the side of Pain, and he deserves player of the series, in my opinion. Again, Tatu definitely deserves a big shout out. This was a great Xin Zhao game. He is a champion that deserves to be played more on more than just R5. I think that a lot of teams are scared to go for him because he is a bit punishable. If he loses in the early game, he just doesn't really have a lot of outs, and so when you're playing him into something like Maokai, if you fail to get a lot of those aggressive plays off, you are just kind of dooming yourself to a loss. Like, it's a very feast or famine playstyle in that regard. But even with something like Smolder, you have a ton of options to be able to play through the early game. We saw that being able to play through the Ezreal, being able to take advantage of the Amumu, who was super far behind in levels throughout this entire game. There were just so many aggressive plays made by the Zin that really capitalized on his strength that other champions don't have right now, which is his ability to skirmish very aggressively in the early game. He's still Xin Zhao. He still does the things that that champion did at a high level. I thought Giggs was great this game on the Leona. Again, the CC chain I thought was the most important part here. Kotz ended up getting to that power spike and ended up doing a lot of damage. Marvin is just generally hyper consistent, as we have seen throughout this tournament. It just was a great showing from Pain across the board. Everybody looking good and everybody deserving to go to that winner's finals. But for Vivo Cade Stars, so much going wrong, in my opinion. Like, this was just a bad series from start to finish. They didn't play well in either of these games. They just got completely beaten in both of them, and I guess that this isn't the most shocking result in the world, but I think we were definitely looking for something at least a little bit different here, because this team had looked relatively good coming out of the VKS Academy finals. They were the champions for a reason, but I think we're kind of starting to see that that was definitely a bit of a miracle playoff run rather than something you can expect moving forward. Telos is a very easy choice for dead of the game here. In game number 2, he took 2 crucial game-deciding fights at level 5 as a Mumu, and that's just... I mean, what do you want me to say? Like, it's the worst level for Amumu for a multitude of reasons. Not only do you not have any meaningful advantage by getting those couple extra points in whatever ability you want to put them in, but you're not level 6, and that's Amumu. Like, that's the whole point. That's why you picked the champion. It just is absurd, in my opinion, that Telos, like, made those decisions and that VKS was fighting around those decisions. I think Amumu's support can actually be very valuable. I would argue, and honestly, my take doesn't look very good when I say this, but I've been making the take that I think Amumu's support is better than Amumu jungle, but not when you play it like this, certainly not when you execute in the way that they did here. I think Tyrion also got completely outplayed throughout most of the series on the top side. Kisei actually was ahead in this game. He actually had quite a bit of a gold lead on Syndra, and there was something that could potentially be done here. I know people are getting really excited about Syndra. This is the first time we have seen her at the entire tournament, as far as I am aware. It was fine. Like, this champ didn't really do any damage in the late game, which I think is what people are kind of looking for when it comes to her. I still think Orianna is kind of the better version of her at the moment, but I understand why people are excited. Kisei was fine in the early game here going into a perma-scaling Smolder. Sorolu, Morteus, they didn't get to do anything. VKS just got completely outplayed. This was not a close series, and now they're going to have to get their wits about them because the team that they have been consistently beating to get to this spot, they couldn't beat them. In fact, they got destroyed by them. They got to regain their mental and be able to bounce back. They face the loser of the series that we're going to talk about up next. I still think that they're in an okay spot to potentially move into top 3 and potentially into top 2, hell, even top 1 if everything were to go right, but this definitely exposed some of their flaws in the fact that they are pretty one-dimensional as a team. But for Pain, great win. This is the most complete team at the tournament right now. Hands-wise, they are certainly the most talented team at the tournament right now, at least in terms of their momentum, and I'm really excited to see what they could do moving forward. But then moving on to our second series of the video and our second series of round 1, and this series is just as intriguing as the first on paper. Definitely not the expected order of these two seeds, but very excited to see both of them here. It's the number 2 seeded Fuego taking on the number 3 seeded Fear x Starforge, and definitely not the order we thought this was going to go in. It's North America's only representative here in the top 4, which is definitely surprising, but it's Latin America's only representative here, the LRN, I believe, the Latin America North representative here for Tier 2 in Fuego. They were kind of a super team over in the LRN. They were doing really well. I think a lot of these players were expected to perform at a high level, and they have so far at the tournament. They have overperformed my expectations by quite a bit. They have genuinely been one of the more intriguing teams at the entire tournament. I think that even though they are the higher seed here, they are going in as underdogs, and I think that actually might help them quite a bit to be able to not play with the expectations that maybe they were playing in towards the back half of the actual, like, main stage regular season. But the big thing for Fuego, they beat Fear x Starforge on day number 3, the last day of competition in the group stage here, and so they definitely have a bit of a mental advantage going into this one, at least in my opinion, but Fear on paper definitely expected to be able to walk out of this series with a win. They've not exactly been the most clinical team down the stretch in a lot of these games. I think the problem that they've run into and the reason that they lost a couple of games on the final day was they were going 50 plus minutes into these games and they just didn't quite have the hands to win some of these final fights, even though they were putting themselves in okay positions to get there in the first place. I think that's a very fixable issue for a team that I think is already really good. You're not worried about the mechanics and like the actual prowess of the players on the team. You are more so worried about their ability to stay locked in and to actually execute, because this is never going to be an actual personnel issue for them. It's always going to be a mental issue if they continue to struggle in those situations. I think Fuego is more than good enough to be able to capitalize on that. We've had some really good performances over the course of this tournament from players like Mataz in the jungle, Zelt in the mid lane. I think they've been kind of the standout players, but Virus FX, I think, has had a couple of good performances. Baula, I think, has had a couple of good performances. I've not been particularly impressed by ADD over the course of this tournament, and obviously over his time just in his career, LCK, LPL, North America, he's been around the block, but, you know, he's certainly more than serviceable enough for you to be able to win with, as they have over the course of this tournament, but it's really about the jungle mid for Fuego, which is what makes it so interesting as a matchup into Fear, because they're also a very jungle mid focused and oriented team. They want XU to be able to generate these big early game leads that they can then snowball into a Blaze Olive getting very fed in the middle of the map and him winning a lot of the late game 5v5s. It's kind of been their strategy, but the problem, at least on the final day of the tournament, was that was kind of a one-dimensional strategy. When you get to these 5v5s and ABO is the only person with a lot of gold going into them, you don't have the resources to beat a team that's a little bit more well-rounded in terms of where their own resources have gone. It's why Fuego was able to beat them on the final day. So certainly something we'll see if they adapt on. I think generally speaking, Fear are favorites, because if Fuego want to go to that style, I think Fear win probably 7 out of the 10 games of even exactly what we saw on that third day, where the just goes super late. I think they have the talent to be able to win a lot of those fights. They just didn't quite get it done in that one, which is why I think they are going into this as pretty big favorites, especially if players like Instinct and Phillip and Winsome can really step up, because I'm already expecting XU and a Blaze Olive to be good in a series like this. But the only way to know is, of course, to kind of watch out if Fuego can repeat their performance. Remember, it's just a best of 3. You've only got to win 2 of 3. That's very doable for both of these teams. So I'm excited to see what happens. But like I said, the only way to know is, of course, to go game by game. And that means starting with game 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Fear x Starforge. And man, this was a game, like, you're looking at the time, you're like, it was a 29-minute win. Yeah, they were down in kills, but they were up in gold. They got a bunch of towers. Like, you feel good about this. No Barons were taken. This couldn't have been that bad of a game. Well, what if I told you that 5 of those 7 kills that they got came in the last fight of the game? What if I told you that up until that point, they were losing 9-2 in terms of kills, they were down in gold, and they had no pressure on the map? And what if I told you that one errant teleport coming in from the Olaf completely obliterated Fuego's chances of winning this game, and all of a sudden it was just immediately over? That's exactly what happened in this game. Truly unbelievable to watch that unfold in front of my eyes. There is no reason for Fear to have won this game. It's kind of the opposite of what happened on day number 3. Perhaps this is their karma kind of neutralizing itself back out, but what the hell happened in this game? This was Fuego kind of controlling a lot of the tempo for a majority of this game, kind of just being better and more on the ball in terms of how they wanted to play around their comp. You're looking at an R5 Olaf, and yet the Poppy was still willing to fight and trade a lot on the top side because she knew she was relatively safe, and ADD was involved in a lot of plays around the map that Phillip just wasn't. Mataz was completely controlling the early game on the Amumu. He was affecting top lane. He was affecting mid lane, completely shutting down a Blaze Olive and really kind of taking away Fear's win condition for the most part in games like this. You had Virus FX and Baula, who I think were doing relatively well. Fuego was in a perfect position to be able to slowly grind out a 35-minute win in this one, and yet, like I said, one errant teleport from an Olaf later, all of a sudden he picks up a quadra kill, and the game is over. It's genuinely insane how this happened. You want to give a lot of credit to Fear for being willing to pull the trigger and also being willing to end the game. This was not the cleanest and most, like, obvious end situation in the world. I think a lot of teams would have been happy taking the fight, taking taking their inhibitor and backing off to play for Baron, but Fear knew they could close. They knew they had enough damage and enough time to be able to end the game, and they did exactly that. Philip kind of has to be player of the game because he is the one who made the game-winning play for Fear, even if he wasn't perfect through the beginning part. Again, a lot of skirmishing on the top side, but the Poppy was more useful, like by and large, over the course of the beginning part of this game, especially linking up plays from the jungle. Philip just didn't really have a lot of pressure up until that final fight where he literally just insta-wins the game for his team. This is why you pick Olaf on R5, but you know, it's not like the most complete performance in the entire world. You had players like Instinct and Winsome that were generally okay throughout this game, but they weren't exactly exuding pressure. Winsome, the only player to die from Fear in that final fight. XU and Ablaze Olive were definitely on the back foot, and in fact, Ablaze Olive is going to get my dud of the game for game number 1 because he was really taken out of it by the Amumu. He wasn't really relevant at all on the Taliyah, and he is, as I've stated, this team's most important player by a pretty considerable margin. Typically, when you have a game state like what Fear was looking at the middle point, the 20 to 25 minute mark here, you're not looking good if you're Fear. You've got a lot of your win conditions taken out of it, and even if you do want to play for Kai'Sa and Olaf, it's just a more difficult proposition than having to play with Taliyah moving around the map, and, you know, Fear just needed a miracle play, and they got it. Like, Ablaze Olive had to be better in lane, just wasn't, and he got bailed out. I think that this is definitely a happy win for Fear. They're not going to be looking back on this and being like, oh god, this sucks, like, you know, we wish we would have done better. They're going to be happy they picked up the victory, but obviously you want to see this team be a bit more clinical. Hopefully they can do that in game number 2. But for Fuego, gosh, like, this has to feel so bad having this just like fall through your fingertips. This was such a close game, and you had complete control, and you just let it get out of hand. Like, you made one critical error, and all of a sudden the game is over. That's got to be like one of the worst feelings of all time at an international tournament like this, representing your region, already overperforming so much, to give Fear essentially a free win in game number 1. It's honestly just not an ideal circumstance. Mataz was excellent in this game. I thought ADD was really good in this game. Overall, the top side of the map in general was just really strong for Fuego. A lot of very proactive early game plays that allowed them to get these small gold leads and really stack that up. I even think mid lane was really good. Zelt had another pretty solid performance on Tristana. Virus, Baula, like, they were generally fine. They didn't have to do too much on the Ziggs and the Leona in the same way that Instinct and Winsome weren't super active throughout every single play of this game. It was mostly a topside focused game from the junglers, but again, it's just one gigantic mistake that ends up costing you, and they're going to have to put it behind them, because going into game number 2, if they lose that now, if you let this affect your mental, you're immediately done. Like, you're down into the lower bracket, the series is over. In a best of 3, you don't have time to kind of wane on a loss like this. But then, if you go out and win game number 2, now all of a sudden you're thinking going into game number 3, well, the series should be over. We should have won it 2-0, because there is no reason for them to have lost game number 1. So definitely a bit of a mental advantage for Fear in that regard, but I'm sure they want to prove that this win was not a fluke, that them being able to get bailed out by this gigantic fight was not nearly as bad as maybe as I'm making it out to be, and that they can take this series 2-0 with a confident win in game number 2. I'm excited to see which one of those ends up happening, but we're going to see right now, because the winner of game number 2 was Fuego. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we are going to a deciding game number 3 moving forward. That was kind of the outcome I think we were hoping for from both of these series, but at least the second one is going to be giving that to us. I think if you're Fuego, obviously you feel good about game 2. This kind of was a stomp. This certainly wasn't nearly as, you know, close as I guess game number 1 was, but really you've got to have that lingering thought in the back of your head that this series should be over. It was always going to be a little bit of a question. If you lost this game, then you're like, well, we should have been in it. And if you win this game, now you're like, this probably should have been a 2-0, but you still got to get the job done going out in game number 3. Talking about game 2, though, talking about how they got there, this was just a very clean, clinical performance and a very clean draft from this team. This is about the most stock standard comp you could possibly put together in terms of League of Legends. Really, the only interesting thing here is the Udyr in the top lane. Something I didn't mention in this video, and I'm realizing now that I did not mention, this is Fearless draft, and so, you know, obviously people who watched my NACL content, they know that the Fearless draft has been something that these teams have been prepping for, but maybe if you're just tuning in for America's Challengers, this is Fearless, so if you draft a champion, you can no longer play them. Neither team can play them in either side of the matchup, and so definitely worth at least kind of, I guess, trying to navigate that a little bit, and so you're going to see some more, I'm not going to say lower tier picks, because there are way too many picks in each role right now for you to ever really run out in a best of 3, even a best of 5. You're not really running out of, like, truly viable champions champions at the current moment just with how many are strong, but going to the stock standard ones, I mean, Jarvan, Azir, Jhin, like as a trio, that's pretty good for Fuego. It just does everything you could ask for. Jarvan is getting a lot of hype right now, and this is a game that kind of backs that up. Mataz is going to get my player of the game on the Jarvan. It's kind of interesting. We've seen basically none of him throughout this entire tournament, and that's really led me to believe that a lot of the hype that he is getting at the current moment is a little bit overstated. I think that Jarvan is often a champion that is very reliant on item strength in order to be as relevant as a lot of the other champs in his role, like Vi or like Xin Zhao, that kind of accomplish similar things, or even Lee Sin that I think can do similar things. I think Vi has always been the most apt comparison because they're both champions that want to be active in the early game, but both kind of rely on having leads in order to be useful in the later half of the game, because both of them just get blown up so quickly if they're at a gold disadvantage. But Mataz executing the early game super well here, and the Jarvan definitely looking powerful. I'll try to monitor this pick, see if it continues to be as strong as it was here moving forward. But ADD, the other player, definitely to shout out. Another really good performance from the top side of the map for Fuego. This has been a strength through both of the first two games. The Poppy game was very strong from him in game number 1. Again, does not get the counter pick. Philip gets the counter pick on R5 because Fuego is on blue side. He blind picks Udyr, which is typically pretty punishable, but Philip goes for the Aatrox, not necessarily what I would have personally gone for in this matchup, and ADD kind of runs roughshot on the Udyr throughout a majority of this game. Unkillable, uncatchable in a lot of instances, certainly unpunishable. And so the Udyr and the Jarvan definitely taking over, but Zelt continues to look very good when the rest of his team is ahead. Varus and Baula, they're fine. I mean, they're weak side right now. That's what Jhin is supposed to be. You're not necessarily surprised by that. It's why you pick that champion. But overall, Fuego very cleanly executing a very nice draft, and I think it very much went in their favor. And then for Fear, you gotta at least be a little bit worried. This game did not look good from Fear. They certainly look a lot worse than what we expected going into the tournament, and they certainly look a lot worse than what they did in the first 2 days, regardless of whether or not you think this team over or underperformed. This is not the, I guess, performance that we were expecting from a team like this. I think that, you know, going up against a team like Fuego, especially a Latin American team like versus North American in terms of that reputation, like NA should be able to take this relatively cleanly, and they have struggled in both of the first 2 games of this series. I think that they should be fine, but there is something clearly kind of off mentally about Fear right now. They're just not playing at full strength. Philip is going to get dud of the game, was completely useless on the Aatrox. ADD kind of ran that top lane and completely took over the game. Not going to blame Philip entirely. I think it's kind of a difficult thing to perform on after 15 minutes when the team is super behind in gold, but certainly worth noting. XU had another poor early game, and I think this is more of kind of just exposing Fear's big weakness, very similar to what we talked about with both Pain and Vivo Cade Stars in the previous series, where a lot of these teams that are really like mechanically talented at this level rely on playing from early advantages. XU is very good at generating gold leads in the NACL, and so, you know, losing early in both of these games was pretty detrimental for Fear. Luckily, they got bailed out, like I said, in game 1, but not so lucky here in game 2, and XU's going to have to be better in game 3 for this team to move on in this series. Blaze Olive has really struggled through the first 2 games here. Instinct and Winsome really didn't get anything done on the Ashe Braum. It's just not been a good look, I would argue, through the first couple of games for Fear. They honestly should be down in lower bracket. They should be facing VKS, but they were bailed out in game 1, and it's up to them to determine whether or not that bailout is going to ultimately be rewarded, and, you know, whether or not they're going to move on to that winners finals and be able to take on Pain Gaming. Fuego has all the momentum in this series, in my opinion, right now going in to this final game, but it is winner take all. The loser, of course, moves down into the lower bracket. Nobody is eliminated from this series, but still a lot on the line. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fear x Starforge. They are going to get the job done here in game number 3. They're going to take the series 2-1, and they are going to avoid disaster by moving on to winners finals. I say avoid disaster. Obviously, they were the lower seed in this matchup. I'm not going to try and sit here and pretend like there was no universe where they ever lose this. I already talked about both games 1 and 2 basically kind of being losses for Fear. They just get down to gigantic early game deficits. You get killed twice at level 1 in game 2. Like, everything's just going wrong for Fear, but they're able to keep their head about them, especially after how day number 3 went. They're able to stay on target, on focus, and they're able to come out with a huge win here in game number 3. And this is the one that mattered at the end of the day. This is the win that ended up being the most consequential for Fuego. you certainly have nothing to be upset over when it comes to this series. You just faced one of the tournament favorites going into this entire thing, and you really took it to them. Like, you made it very difficult for them to walk out of this series with a victory. Unlucky for you that the worst game for you, in particular, in this series ended up being the third and final one. But overall, I think I feel a lot better about Fuego coming out of this series. I was concerned that, this was a really good, main group stage run from them, that they did really well at the beginning part of this tournament when people were still figuring things out and while teams were underperforming, but I didn't know if that was going to last going into the playoffs here, especially because of that loss to Dragonsteel in their final game of the main stage. But they proved here they deserve to be here. They absolutely deserve to be a top 4 team, and right now they are better than teams like Dragonsteel, and they deserve to have that spot. So credit to Fuego even in the loss, but player of the game for me is going to go to Winsome. I thought he was the most important player in this one. Blaze Olive, I think, got it on the broadcast. He got player of the series on the broadcast. I don't agree with that. Certainly not with player of the series. I do think that games 1 and 2 from him just weren't particularly good. The Talia, the Jace, they just didn't look all that great. Winsome was much more valuable to me in game number 3 here. I think ABO was obviously the big damage threat and was very consistent on the Hui. He kind of did his ABO thing where he gets a lot of gold and resources going into the late game and is very valuable in the fights because of that. But I thought without Winsome, this game becomes a lot more difficult to win. For Fear, the fact that he's able to kind of jump in and duck and dive out of these fights, he had redemption to be able to clean up that final fight and keep everybody healthy. Like, there was just so much value added because of Winsome's presence in this game, and I do think that they lose it, or at least it doesn't become nearly as easy without him. I'm not going to say they lose it. This was a pretty dominant victory. They were the better team in this one, especially when they were actually able to get like actual 5v5s and 4v4s and even manned fights. Like, that's where they really shine. That's where their hand stiff can actually come into effect, but Winsome was the biggest influence on that. Again, not trying to take anything away from ABO because he was very good on the Hui, and this was by far his best game of the entire series, but I just think Winsome deserves a lot of credit. And then player of the series as a whole for me is actually going to go to Philip in the top lane. I feel like that's really the only fair answer to give this one. He was really good in game number 1 on the Olaf. He basically single-handedly won that with that teleport flank, and then he was very valuable in this game on the Camille. I think oftentimes I'm very critical of Camille as a champion because she's just so volatile. We've seen so many performances over the past couple of months where she gets picked as a counter pick on the top side, ends up not really doing all that much in lane, ends up getting slightly outscaled by a Cassante, and just doesn't have the same kind of pressure that she needs to have because she's good in a side lane, but she's not like the best champion in the game in a side lane. She's good in team fights, but she's not the best champion in the game in team fights. She's just kind of okay at everything unless she has a lot of gold. Luckily for Philip, he actually was able to get a lot of gold in that game. This is really the way to gatekeep Camille. If you're able to win early, that champ is as busted as everything you could make it out to be, but it is really up to whether or not you get those resources. Luckily, Philip was very good in this series outside of that Aatrox game in game number 2. I just think that he was the most important player towards Fear's success, and I think he is the reason they're walking out with the win, so he is going to get my player of the series. XU, I think, definitely had a better showing here on the Maokai when he is able to control the early game. It's really free. Fear plays around that incredibly well, and I think that is going to be something we need to consistently monitor. If XU can win early games, this team is going to win games. Instinct is generally fine. He was good in this series, but for Fear, a lot closer than maybe you would have liked it, and for Fuego, unfortunately, it was just so close to being a Fuego victory. You couldn't get yourself over the line, though. Mataz was unbelievably good in this series. I really want to shout him out, because I think if there was like a star-making performance at this tournament, Mataz is definitely one of the players that has really kind of risen up on my board for people to watch, especially with the LLA integrating with the LCS and, LATAM kind of integrating with North America going into next year. Having a player like this that has looked so good at this tournament against some of the top prospects that North America has to offer, it does increase my excitement for potentially seeing, LATAM players next year in the LCS, especially if we're going to get young stars like this, because he's just so aggressive. He is constantly looking for play after play after play. It honestly reminds me of how we talked about Jose Deodo at the start of his, kind of rise in, 2019 or so. Mataz kind of reminds me a lot of that, where it's just, find an angle to try to make a play. If it works, great. If it doesn't, well, at least you tried. You're never going to take your foot off the gas. And I think that's such a fun play style to watch. Sometimes it can get him in trouble, but he's constantly looking for play after play. There is no downtime in a game playing against Mataz, and that's very fun to watch. I think Zelt has also kind of shown off a lot of his very good mechanics over the course of this tournament. Hopefully he is another player that we can continue to monitor. Unfortunately, Virus FX is going to get my dud of the game here for game number 3. He just felt pretty ineffective over the course of this. Ezreal kind of needs to be a pretty integral part of this comp. If Viego's not getting perma resets, then the Ezreal actually kind of has to be one of the primary carries in terms of damage in these front-to-backs, and Varus just wasn't actually doing all that much damage over the course of this game. Winsome was just kind of controlling the bot lane 2v2, and of course, he wasn't all that effective in the 5v5s, which is a problem. So Varus is unfortunately going to get my dud of the game here. Him and Baula were just kind of irrelevant throughout the series. ADD probably played his best series of the entire tournament here against Philip, who was also playing well, just didn't end up mattering. Cassante is unkillable in these fights, but only so much you can do when the rest of your team is already losing. So for Fuego, again, it's really hard to feel anything other than good about this team coming out of this because they did look so solid in all three of these games. But for Fear, you're definitely feeling better knowing that you're going to be moving on to winners finals. Alright, but that is going to do it for my America's Challengers round number 1 overview and analysis video. We still know the 4 teams that are available in bracket. Nobody has been eliminated just yet, but we know our upper bracket finals. We know our lower bracket round number 1 matchup. Both of those matchups, as I said, have already happened, and so I'm not going to preview them super heavily in this video. We're going to be covering in a video that's coming out in a couple of hours, so stay tuned for that, but I haven't seen them yet. So just quickly to throw out what my expectations are going into that, I would expect Fear to actually be able to take care of Pain. Pain has looked better, but Fear should be better than them. They genuinely should, and I would imagine VKS is going to be able to beat Fuego. I mean, who knows, right? Again, Fuego and Pain are the higher seeds. They're the 2 highest seeds at the tournament left, and so perhaps we see them move on. And, I wouldn't be surprised by any outcome at this point. Fuego looked much better in round number 1. I just think VKS is a better team. I think Kisei is the best player in that series, and I think that that will be clear. And I'm much less confident about Fear beating Pain, just with how things have looked. But if Fear can get on their own clock, if they can play their own style and genuinely control the tempo in their way, they should be the best team left at this tournament. So we'll see if that ends up playing out. Maybe I'm just being NA biased. Let me know down in the comments section below. But hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about America's Challengers. We actually posted our World's Meta Report video yesterday. You can check that out here on the channel. We're going to have the top 20 players at the World Championships tomorrow alongside round number 2 here of America's Challengers. You can check all of that out. And the best way to do that is to hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.